button. I got to do a couple of things. All right, I got to do one or two quick things here to make something. Hold on just a second here. I got to get rid of that and that. Boy, you talk about inartful, but I got to do that to make my screen clear. Good. All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm thrilled that you're here, and I'm not going to spend much time running in place because we got a lot to do here, but I welcome you. I especially want you to reach out to your state broadcast associations and thank them for doing this. They have been so enthusiastic in supporting your continued education, and I am just honored and thrilled that they have made this available to you. So if you find this useful, I hope that you'll just take a moment, send them an email, tell them that you appreciate them taking an interest in your journalism education, because not every state broadcast group does it, but yours does. So thanks a million. I also want to ask you to please be a full participant today. So flip on your microphone, be a full participant. You don't have to agree. In fact, I urge you to feel free to push back and disagree and all of those things. That's what newsrooms do. That's what journalists do. So I want you to feel free to fully engage, ask questions, and so on. We're planning on this. For some of you, I know you only have an hour, and that's fine. You'll get a lot. Remember, we're recording this. We'll put it back up. You'll be able to take it in. We're going to run closer to 90 minutes total, but I'm going to get right to the meat of things. You're not going to miss much. If you have to drop out at an hour, fine, great, glad you were here. You can join the recorded session later. But we're going to run about a full 90 minutes here because we got a lot of content, right? Cool. All right, battling bias. First, let me just stipulate we all have biases, all right? Anybody who thinks that they are unbiased is, I think, kidding themselves. So we have a lot of ways that we develop biases. Our education, our age, our upbringing, where we grew up, our race, our ethnicity, our religion, whether you served in the military, your sexual identity, all of these things are influences, right? And all of them help you to shape your biases. And you may even change your biases throughout your life. You probably believe some things when you were young that you won't believe when you get to my age. So Muhammad Ali said, a person who believes all the same things at age 50 that they believed at age 20 has wasted 30 years. And I think that's about right. So we all have biases, and biases are not bad. They're not good. They're just human because you have opinions. And so I want to start by saying we all have biases. The challenge for you is to recognize your biases and then report through them or around them. Recognize your biases and remember that your biases shape everything you do in journalism. You make thousands of decisions every day about what you're going to cover, who you're going to talk to, how you're going to illustrate this story, what their angle is going to be, all that stuff. We're going to cover all that stuff as we have our conversation today. But I want you to be aware of how many decisions you make every day. And all of them at some level is shaped by your bias. Bias also can be substituted for another word of editorial decision-making or values. All of those are part of this conversation. I wanted to point out a sample of something I just saw, and I wanted you to pay attention because this has to do with bias in words that we use. And they seem like simple words, right? So the AP reported U.S. employers added a robust 200,000 jobs in January. That was in 2018, 200,000. Robust. 200,000 is robust. Make note of that. Except when it's December 2021. Then 210,000 is sluggish. How can 200,000 be robust in 2018, but 210,000 be sluggish in 2021? And therein lies the problem, right? When you use these words like robust and sluggish, those are a reflection of your bias. What is robust? What is sluggish? And when you start characterizing using those kinds of what I would call subjective adjectives, that is opinionated adjectives, when you start using subjective adjectives, some level of bias gets mirrored into that. Remember that this could be perceived as, as favoring Donald Trump. This number could be perceived as Joe Biden as a failure. One number is higher than the other, and yet it gets characterized differently. Look, they weren't alone. CNN did the same thing. U.S. economy has 145,000 jobs in December, flat out reporting, right? But disappointing jobs report. American employers added only 210,000 new jobs in November, and that was in December 2021, same number I gave you. So what is it that's going on here? How could 145,000 not be characterized by the same reporter, by the way, but $210,000 is a disappointment? If you're going to use numbers like that, then probably the best way to use a number like that would be to use it in a quotation. So, Biden calls 210,000 great news would be different than you characterizing it as disappointing. In that same way, what I would say to you is just generally avoid subjective adjectives like good and bad, like big and small. Look, these are all just relative, right? Whether something is good news or bad news is relative to whether something is good or bad for you or good or bad for somebody else. I remember one time when I was a news director, I had a propane dealer in town, an LP gas dealer. I said, quit calling it bad weather. It's great weather for me when it's cold and snowy, because I get to sell a lot of LP gas for people's heaters, so why do you call it bad weather? Fair point. We'll just report the temperature and let you decide if it's good or bad, tiny or huge, shallow or deep. Shallow or deep largely depends on how tall you are, I think. Whether water is shallow depends on whether it's over your nose. This is a big one. Only or just, right? It only cost $4 billion. Well, is that a lot? I don't know. Not if you're building an interstate, maybe. It's he just made $300,000 a year. Well, if you were a major league pitcher, that might matter. But if you were a newscast producer in Portland, Maine, that's probably a lot of money. So these are judgment words, and I'm just would any of you? I know that being journalists, you all have these hangups. Would you want to add anything, any of these words? If so, Angela's watching the chat. If you want to type them in there, but if you want to flip on your microphone and get something off your chest, right now would be the time to do it. Flip on your microphones, add a couple of more words. Any other words you want to avoid because they are judgmental, they're biased? Oh, by the way, liberal and conservative would be a good one, right? What is liberal? What does that actually mean? What is conservative? What does that actually mean? They mean different things to different people, right? Conservative used to mean small government. But conservatives under Donald Trump ran up the federal deficit to unprecedented levels at that time. So what does conservative mean to you? Does it mean bigger military? Is that what it means? Does liberal mean social spending, big government? What does liberal and conservative mean now? There's another one, pro-life and pro-choice. I always thought that was an interesting didactic kind of thing. If you had pro-life, seems like the opposite to that should be pro-death. But what does a pro-lifer actually want? And I would say to you that I would describe what it is they favor. They're against abortion no matter what. Okay, well, that's much clearer than pro-life, because pro-life sometimes includes caveats like except in the case of rape and incest, for example, or only after the the first trimester or something like that, So be as specific as you can be. All right. Anybody want to add anything here? Remember, you're going to be a full participant. Go ahead, Angela.
We have a few in the chat.
What did they add?
Someone said the family wants justice. That phrase comes to mind.
Oh, that's a great one. The family wants justice. Yeah. What would justice look like? Yeah. A public hanging, or what is it that you want here? Yeah.
And also left wing and right wing, those
Oh,
parameters. aren't
perfect. Yeah,
equal.
great. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, left wing. Yeah, those numbers, those words just don't mean anything. Just be specific. What do they favor? What do they oppose? Right? Yeah, great. Great additions, everybody. So these words get into our vernacular and we just use them over and over and over again. You may remember this day.
It's a very, very explosive hearing.
Michael Cohen delivers explosive testimony.
Potentially explosive day here on the Hill.
His testimony revealing explosive.
Yes, it's explosive.
There are some explosive claims.
Explosive hearing.
Today's hearing was explosive.
Michael Cohen's explosive testimony.
Explosive. It's explosive. Explosive.
Explosive.
Explosive.
Explosive.
Explosive.
Explosive.
As explosive as it gets.
Explosive testimony.
Explosive testimony.
Explosive testimony.
That explosive testimony.
Explosive 9 hours. And we expect another explosive day of explosive claims.
That is a rather explosive allegation.
Truly explosive public testimony. Pretty explosive material.
One explosive revelation after another.
Explosive claims.
Explosive allegations.
Explosive testimony.
Explosive public testimony.
Explosive after his explosives.
An explosive chain of events.
Very explosive. I suspect it's going to become even more explosive.
Yes, I bet it will. So sometimes these words just get in our head and they just come out your fingers and you write them. And whether something is explosive or not, I think is in the minds of the viewer. It shouldn't be your decision that something is explosive. Tell me what they said or what they did, what they said that nobody expected. Tell me why you think it's explosive or why people are saying that. Quote somebody is saying that. But for you to characterize it, first of all, it's just silly. It sounds silly because it's what everybody says. But it also is certainly a reflection of bias. You think what he said was important enough that it was explosive, where other people, including Trump supporters, were saying, well, he's a liar. Everybody knows he's a liar. He's admitted to be a liar. So why should you pay attention to him? What he's saying is not explosive. What he's saying is a lie. That's what they were saying that day. So just be careful about these crutch words.
It's a
right?
very
Bias also shows up in the words and also the tone that we choose. So an old ethicist friend of mine, Bob Steele at the Poynter Institute, used to say tone and degree can say a lot about what the public might think we think about a story. That is, the tone of our story, where we play it, the words we use, how much emphasis we use, but the degree, how much are we covering it? Where do we cover it? How do we promote it? Are we leading with it? Are we teasing to it? All those kinds of things have to do with tone. And with that in mind, I want to give you this example. Some of you may know what this is. Very controversial Twitter post that didn't seem to be so controversial on its face, but boy, did it get a reaction online. Waukesha will hold a moment of silence today, marking 1 week since a car drove through a city Christmas parade, killing 6 people and injuring scores of others. Why is that controversial? Why did that cause a stir?
Because it didn't mention anything about the person who drove the car.
Exactly right, Ryan. Exactly right. They said, what do you mean a car drove through a city Christmas parade? A car didn't do it. You know, an attempted murderer did it. A killer did it, right? And so people were critical of CNN saying, look, you guys are in favor of bond reform, bail reform. You're in favor of letting people out awaiting trial. You're in favor of all of that stuff. And you're taking no notice of here's a person who's been arrested multiple times, a career criminal, as they say, who is accused of this, was out on a very low bail for another suspected violent crime. You're just weak on crime and you're pretending like nobody's responsible for this. MSNBC actually called it an accident and was similarly criticized for it. Look, whether you mean to be biased or not, people are looking to affirm their feelings that you are. And what we don't want to do is hand the gun for them to shoot us with it, right? Just be thoughtful and careful about the words you're using and ask yourself, how might somebody take this in a way that would misconstrue what it is we're trying to say? I'm not saying go weak. I'm not saying be timid. I'm saying be precise. Just be precise. That's it. Bias can show up in how we frame a story. This is a really important one, and I'm going to spend a little time on it. Story frames. Believe it or not, I mean, you think about this. Every day, every story, you have to decide how you're going to frame the story. And by that, who did what, basically. It's the story focus. What are we going to focus on in this story? It's probably easier if I just give you some examples. So for example, U.S. all these headlines came within minutes of each other, right? U.S. military to mandate COVID vaccines by mid-September. Okay, so the military is going to mandate, it's going to force you to do it. Another headline from Stars and Stripes, actually, potential military vaccine mandate brings distrust and support. In other words, it's the frame of their story is the opposite reaction. Not just that it's going to happen, but that there is strong reaction to it. The New York Times, younger military personnel reject vaccine in warning for commanders and the nation. This story is not focused on people who are saying, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, let's get our vaccine. It's focusing instead. They're giving a lot more weight on the younger military who are rejecting it. They're giving more attention to people rejecting than on the more than 90% who have gotten vaccinated. I think that's really interesting. Military Times, COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy higher among soldiers, Black service member study shows. In other words, vaccine hesitancy was higher among soldiers than it was among the civilian population in the United States. So again, they're focusing on rejection rather than acceptance. And in some ways, that's what news does. In some ways, we focus on the abnormal, not on the normal. We focus sometimes on what didn't happen more than what actually happened. In other words, somebody didn't get to work safely today, rather than 1 million people in Sacramento got to work just fine today. Well, that's not much news. It's the 3 who didn't, that we're going to focus on. Let me just story frames. This one just made me laugh. And I don't mean to be picking on these guys at WPTV down in West Palm, but I'm just going to play 5 seconds of theirs. So it just made me laugh because the story frame was so bizarre to me. Here we go.
Question: do you ever think about the germs on your wristwatch?
Well, no, actually, I don't. Actually, I've never thought about germs on my wristwatch. But the lead of the story is framing like germs on your wristwatch is going to be a big problem for you, right? So they're taking something that is obviously a very, very minor threat to your health, and they're framing it as though this is going to be deserving of substantial amounts of time and effort in our newscast. And that's what a story frame does. Story frames decide what's important and what deserves voice. So I'm going to give you an example of a story, and we're going to play out the story frame a little bit. So Biden administration can't keep up with border surge of migrant children. Border Patrol official warns. So this headline says that the Biden administration just simply is not keeping up. LA Times, amid rise in child migration, is there a Biden border crisis? By the way, it is my experience that anytime you ask a question in a headline, you can always answer the question no, because if the answer was yes, then they would have said there's a border crisis. So journalists often will ask questions, but the answer is no. Joe Biden's reversal of Trump's border ban on solo children's increases cartel profits. I don't know. As Biden faces ongoing surge of migrant children, Republicans criticize White House for border crisis. These are all different story frames. This is what CBS did. I'm just going to play so all of those are critical. The Biden's got a crisis, he's not doing enough, and so on. And that this was CBS's headline on that same day.
The Biden administration is working to find housing for thousands of migrant children who have entered the U.S. at the southern border.
Their story frame is so wildly different from all those other story frames. The Biden administration is working to find a solution. That's their story frame. So while all of those other examples I showed you where the Biden administration has a crisis, CBS's headline is the Biden administration is working to find a solution. See the difference in story frame? So they said the Biden administration is working to find housing. Totally different take on the story. So let me play out the story, and then we're going to play with it a little bit. I'm actually going to re-edit the story to see whether we can put a completely different bias on the story by just re-editing it. Here we go.
The Biden administration is working to find housing for thousands of migrant children who have entered the U.S. at the southern border. Right now, many are being placed into overcrowded facilities. These detention centers reportedly do not have enough resources to provide proper access to food, beds, and good hygiene. Mireya Villarreal reports from Mission, Texas.
Children, young and alone. The pace of unaccompanied minors illegally crossing into the U.S. is now being treated as a humanitarian crisis. Tonight, more than 4,000 children are in custody at overcrowded processing facilities, a 30% surge in the last week.
Those Border Patrol stations and facilities are not intended for the care of children.
To relieve the overflow, this Dallas Convention Center will be used as a facility to hold up to 3,000 teenage boys. Many families are being falsely told the border is open. The Biden administration is also no longer using the Trump-era policy of expelling migrant children because of health concerns created by the pandemic. New temporary processing facilities like this one in Donna, Texas are opening. Children interviewed by Neha Desai, a lawyer representing migrant youth, say they were hungry, some only showering once in 7 days. Desai telling CBS News conditions were so overcrowded that they had to take turns sleeping on the floor. The Biden administration is now turning to FEMA for assistance with increasing logistical challenges for shelter and processing. Today, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy led a GOP delegation touring the El Paso border.
The sad part about all of this, it didn't have to happen. There's no other way to claim it than a Biden border crisis.
Heartbreaking. It's a very emotional issue for a lot of people.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki addressing the emergency.
The options here are send the kids back on the journey, send them to unvetted homes, or work to expedite moving them into shelters. That's exactly what we're focused on doing.
There are about 3,000 unaccompanied minors being held in a federal facility right now, and they are being held longer than that 3-day period. Border Patrol has this facility that's about a mile down the road from here, and local law enforcement is telling me still this is a hot spot. Mexico is right over my shoulder, and they are saying they are seeing hundreds of people cross through this area illegally every day without an end in sight. Elaine?
All right. So that story focused largely on the Biden administration's response to try to do something about it. And then there's a little bit of criticism of the Biden administration, and then there's another defense talking about how hard they're working and so on. And one of the lessons that I want to emphasize to you is that you tend to set the tone of your story at both the beginning and the end of the story. And this story really does bury the criticism so deep in the story that it's very difficult to even remember what the Republicans said. But what if we took essentially the same information and re-edited it, repositioned the critics to be on either end of the story rather than the more humanitarian kind of view? So let's change the story frame and see if we detect a different bias by using the same material, but in a different order.
The sad part about all of this, it didn't have to happen.
Children, young and alone. Tonight, more than 4,000 children are in custody at overcrowded processing facilities, a 30% surge in the last week. Many families are being falsely told the border is open. The Biden administration is also no longer using the Trump-era policy of expelling migrant children because of health concerns created by the pandemic. A lawyer representing migrant youth say they were hungry, some only showering once in 7 days. Desai telling CBS News conditions were so overcrowded that they had to take turns sleeping on the floor.
The options here are send the kids back on the journey, send them to unvetted homes, or work to expedite moving them into shelters. That's exactly what we're focused on doing.
There's no other way to claim it than a Biden border crisis.
See how different that story is just by putting him on either end of it? The way you open and close a story very often sends a signal to the public about what they think you meant. And I urge you to edit backwards. And by that, I mean, look at the end of the story and see if the end of the story is consistent with the focus of the story that you set early on. Very often we'll be so careful writing the lead, the teases. We'll be so careful writing the front of the piece. And at the end of the piece is where our bias seeps out. And so the sorry sucker is going to jail and everybody's happy. Okay, wait, what? So you got to be really thoughtful about what you close with, because that's what hangs in the viewer's ear. That's what sticks in their mind. The closing of the piece is every bit and maybe even more important than the lead. The lead sets conflict. The close is the so what. The close is the here's what it all means. Bob Dotson, the great journalist from NBC, said, stories generally work like this. Hey, you see so. Hey, get your attention. You, this is why this matters to you. See, here's the evidence. So this is what it means. And I think that's right. Most narrative stories actually do follow that model. Hey, you see so. Anybody want to say anything about this?
This isn't necessarily about this article, but I was going to say, I think it's really important for journalists to figure out really what the focus of the story is before they're writing. I was reading an article from a journalist who I think she had recently left the business and was reading through a bunch of articles about mask mandates in schools. And it was talking about all the conflict, coming up at school board meetings and everything. And it was after she left the business that she realized how much the focus was all about the fighting.
Yes.
Rather than the focus being about, okay, this is what happens if the children don't wear masks. This is what happens if the children do wear
Amy.
masks.
That's a terrific point. That what real percentage of people really are having such a conflict with this? And the answer is not most, not even close. So we're giving so much attention on deniers, so much attention on fringes that as Amy, I think, so beautifully points out, instead of really focusing on the news of the moment, we're focused on the controversy of the moment. And we're doing so at, I think, a tremendous expense. I'm not saying that we don't cover controversy. Of course we do. But what does it mean really, right? Amy, thank you for that. It's beautifully told. All right. The fallacy of fairness. This may be controversial. It might even be a little shocking that somebody from the Poynter Institute would say, be careful about being too fair, but hear me out. Hear me out. My concern is that because you are right-minded, good journalists, you're trying to make sure that you don't send the signal that you are biased about something. And that's right. It's right and good that you would be concerned. But my concern is that we are so worried about not being perceived as being biased that we can go into something that some people call false equivalency, where we give voice to people who simply don't deserve it because they don't know what they're talking about. They're just spewing false information. Well, I need to get the other side. Well, there's not always another side. If you're doing a story about global warming, I'm sorry, I don't really care whether you think there's global warming. There is. I don't care if you think that the world is round. It is. I don't really care whether you think the vaccine works. It does. I don't care whether you think that millions of people have died because of COVID. They have. And this whole notion that we have to give voice to everybody who has an opinion just because they disagree, I think is not healthy for good journalism. Does this mean that you should close your mind and not listen to contrary evidence? Absolutely not. Of course, be open to contrary evidence. Does this mean that you don't give voice to prominent people like presidents or prime ministers who falsely believe information or spew information? No, you do give voice to them, but you don't let them get on and off unchallenged. In fact, I would surround their false information with true information. Let me give you an example, and then I want to get your reaction. If you disagree, I want to hear from you. Here you go.
The Atlanta native is skeptical of the vaccines, thanks in large part due to the legacy of the unethical Tuskegee study in which Black men with syphilis were deliberately not treated. And despite the information she's seen, she worries about potential links to rare conditions like inflammation of the heart, recently reported in 300 of the 20 million young people vaccinated.
But how do I know that that small percentage won't be me?
Britt, who works at an Atlanta record label, says she doesn't trust the vaccine and instead trusts her own immune system.
I would just rather go take vitamin C or make sure that I'm eating healthier just to make sure that on my end it'll be better for my body to fight off rather than just taking the vaccination.
Britt,
here's the problem. The problem is there is just no medical evidence that taking vitamin C and eating healthy food is going to keep you from getting COVID. Now, there is sufficient evidence to say that if you're immunocompromised, if you're malnourished, if you are vitamin deficient, that you're more likely to be infected or suffer severe consequences if you get infected. But there just isn't any believable information, according to the CDC. There is no believable, demonstrably true information that taking vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc will prevent you from being infected. If you are sufficiently nourished, then your chances are already lower. But this story fails to point out that taking vitamins should not be, according to the CDC, a substitute for getting a vaccine. This is leading us to believe that it's a reasonable thought that you can avoid the vaccine by taking vitamins. And that's just not supported by medical evidence. So I think that this is an opportunity for you to say, some wrongly believe that taking vitamin C will prevent you from getting COVID. Then use the soundbite. Then follow up by saying, but CDC says, vitamins should not be a substitute for the vaccine. In other words, surround the false information or the untrue information with demonstrably true cited information. Some people buy into the false notion that the vaccines aren't safe, however, in soundbite, however, and then set the record straight. What do you think of this notion that if we are going to use demonstrably false information in an attempt to give voice, we have an obligation to surround it with demonstrably true information and not just let people spew their opinions because we're trying to sound fair? Am I off base here? Call me on it.
Someone in the chat made a point. Jay said another problem, the agencies we rely on as news sources also have their own biases.
Yes. Yes. I agree with what you say. And so in truth, it's always your reputation at stake. So when you use something from fill in the blank, Reuters, CNN, Guardian, whoever it is, AP, whoever it is, ultimately, you're still the one responsible for it because the viewer only knows that it came from you, right? So I know that puts a lot of onus on busy people, but the fact of the matter is it's still your reputation. The words are still coming out of your mouth. And if there is something contentious, be sure that you are citing the source as closely as you can. So for today, for example, Pfizer is claiming that its vaccine if you get both doses of its vaccine plus the booster, there's every reason to believe, Pfizer says, that you will be as vaccinated against the Omicron variant as you would be if you took the vaccines against the Delta variant. Now, that's not even according to the FDA. That's according solely to Pfizer. And what I would say to you is that you should cite that probably more than you think you should. Anytime there is that kind of a claim, do not report it as a truth. Report it as a claim, because it is still early data, very early data, 2 weeks of drug trial data. And we may find very different answers as they get more data. So, what I would say to you is just overly cite your source so that you can say, this is who's saying this. So you can weigh this out as you will, knowing the source. Anybody else?
We refer to it as the truth sandwich. So similar to what you have here with the statement of fact, you may have the sound bite and then another statement of fact so that it's buffered for legitimacy.
Yeah, I love that. I love that phrase. The whole idea of just sandwiching the facts around the subjective. And if you choose to use the subjective facts, ask yourself, why are we using this? Are we using it just to be provocative, or is it actually informative? So let me give you an example of this. And I think I'm going to put my cards on the table on this one. This is a really unusual piece, like really unusual piece. And I'm a big fan of it, but you might hate it. And if you do, I want to hear from you. So this is from WFAA in Dallas. It's from a week or so ago. And they covered the rally at Daley Plaza, where QAnon supporters showed up expecting Bobby Kennedy to show up. Well, you'll see. So watch the piece and then let's talk about it. Here's what I want you to look for. Is the story first? Is the story worth covering? Did you learn anything by listening to the story? And third, does the reporter signal any bias in the piece? Okay. Let's give it a shot. This is WFAA in Dallas.
On that Tuesday morning in Dallas's Dealey Plaza, this is a sample of what we heard. And
I know a lot of why I'm here was ordained by the Lord.
What we saw.
I should think that the police would come and block off the street or something too, you know?
Who's your president? I'm here to support God-fearing patriots in the movement.
A movement that on that morning.
We need music or something. What are you expecting?
What am I expecting?
Well, we'll let them tell you.
There was an event that was said to possibly happen here today.
Word on the street is that JFK Jr. will show up and introduce his parents.
12:29, the same time of day that JFK Sr. was shot here in the spot.
Probably the majority of us know that JFK Jr. is alive.
You're expecting JFK Jr.?
Absolutely.
Okay, how's that going to happen?
He never died.
Are we going to see him today?
JFK Jr.?
Yeah, that's what everyone's telling me.
We're hoping. To hope and pray.
And then after that?
He'll probably be the vice president with Trump.
I hope I'm right. You know, I believe I'm right. And I believe today is going to be biblical.
Well, it wasn't biblical. JFK Jr., who died in a plane crash in 1999, did not show up.
Biblical.
That's fascinating.
Fascinating to a professor who studies this stuff.
But Donald Trump always holds his cards to the last minute.
This is really common in apocalyptic religions, that the end never quite happens, but it's always around the corner.
We are Q.
Dr. Michael Phillips is an author and a professor of American history at Collin College.
1229, what would be the mirror of 1229?
And in this peaceful gathering where JFK Jr. did not make an appearance, he sees more than just political theater. He sees potential trouble.
It's a merger of far right-wing politics with apocalyptic religious beliefs.
Strong religious component.
Dr. Kimmy King is an attorney and professor of political science at UNT Denton.
Some people will call it cult. Some people will call it a family. What matters is that there's a belief structure there that you share in common. It's when that belief structure gets challenged that it becomes problematic.
The Southern Poverty Law Center considers QAnon a sprawling spiderweb of right-wing internet conspiracy theories with anti-Semitic and anti-LGBTQ elements that falsely claim the world is run by a secret cabal of pedophiles who worship Satan and are plotting against President Trump. In 2019, the FBI warned of conspiracy theory-driven domestic extremists as a growing threat, with QAnon on that FBI list. And QAnon converts were a visible part of the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, and among the hundreds arrested so far.
I think the ability of the internet to mobilize people that believe in a violent apocalypse, that's disturbing.
You start connecting dots and you're like, are you kidding me right now?
The distance between QAnon and a mainstream political party is not as distant as I would hope.
Oh, wow, it's coming in pretty clear.
On that Tuesday morning,
Well, that means something.
where conspiracy theories were the order of the day,
Elvis is still alive.
The Elvis.
The Elvis is still
Okay.
alive.
You
And
work
this is
with-
where I lose you.
Are you pulling my leg? You
Nope.
believe all this stuff? You really do?
Listen, first of all, I believe in God. I'm not some wacko person. I believe in this 100%.
there was one real truth several of these people agreed to talk about.
But you got to understand that most of the world is going to think that's just crazy.
That's why half my family won't talk to me anymore.
They won't.
And my girlfriend thinks I've lost my mind.
That is actually a very common phenomena too.
Entire online communities like this one on Reddit are dedicated to that. Families that conspiracy theories like these have torn apart.
We've lost families, we've lost marriages have been destroyed, people have lost jobs, their livelihoods, because of something they believe in.
And these are people who feel powerless and alone.
There is this need to feel like you belong and that on some level you are right.
The Q community itself gives them a new sense of family.
Michael, how are you?
Family led that morning
Beyond excellent, by the way.
by a man who calls himself
Negative 48 was here, which I don't know where he's at.
Negative 48.
And what does that mean?
48's evil. EVIL. E is 5, V is 22, I is 9, L is 12. 48. Negative evil. Negative 48.
Belief in a secret language of numbers,
Well, there's a gathering here today.
part of this mindset too.
Donald Trump always holds his cards to the last minute. The last minute.
Okay. Are we at the last minute yet?
No, it's the middle of the day.
Which reminded Dr. Phillips of this ad in a Dallas newspaper that morning in 1963 that listed grievances against JFK and his photos as mugshots.
He hadn't gotten to Dallas yet. He was looking at the Dallas newspaper with that ad. He said, we're going into nut country. When a city gets a reputation like that, it becomes a magnet.
It was so nice to meet you.
Thank you. Do you have my card?
A magnet whose center that morning was Dealey Plaza.
You can save this footage and review it later and you'll be going, wow, she was right about everything.
I don't know what's wrong with those people. That's what they're going to say.
And you know what I say to them? What's wrong with you?
What a great place to meet someone like-minded.
Like-mindedness you can pass off as unusual,
Well, you realize you're dealing with famous people here, so they usually run late.
or like the experts.
I'm here to see and listen and obey
Watch with a very real measure of concern.
and spread love.
Truth is boring. Fiction is way more interesting sometimes.
In Dallas,
God bless America.
Why would anybody make all this up?
I'm Kevin Reese.
All right. How did they do? Remember, this is a conversation about bias. How did he do navigating bias and explaining the issue rather than just covering an event?
Can I speak?
Please do.
The thing that I think makes it objective or increases its objectivity is the old journalism trick, right? Go to the professor, see what the professors think, and they can usually provide a pretty, because they study this stuff, right? So it brings an air of officiality to the story, which I enjoyed. If I were to criticize it, I were to say that I'm never a fan of music in stories unless it's on tape, like at the event music, because it just seems manipulative. He lost me a little bit once the sinister music started playing underneath some of the portions, because I think, in my opinion, the words of the people and the reactions of the people always speak louder than any sort of music you can put in.
Amen to that. Yeah. Anytime you add, you're starting to add a layer of subjectivity, right? Yeah. Well said. Indeed. Did you learn anything in the piece? Come on, I got 60 people on the call here. Talk to me. You're journalists. What'd you think of what they did?
Al, I think this was too long, and they lost me as a good standing citizen when they were talking about JFK, and I would have turned the channel. I don't think it deserves this length of time, and let's deal in sanity.
How did the story not deal in sanity?
When they're talking about JFK is going to bring his parents to introduce them to the crowd. That was towards the beginning.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, I get it. These people actually gathered there in that city. They actually gathered. I mean, there was a substantial number of people there, and they created, quite an event. And some stations covered it as a daily story. In this case, they put the brakes on and said, let's don't cover this as a daily news event. Let's try to get beyond the what to the so what. What are they actually doing?
That was the story, right? I mean, that was the story.
I think I would have ignored it altogether unless something significant happened.
Well, and that's an option, James. That totally is an option. And largely national news did ignore it. If it's a local story and it's happening in your town, it's slightly more difficult. And it might even signal a bias that you're not, in fact, willing to acknowledge that there are people who follow this point of view, without giving it credence. The reason, James, the reason I'm showing this is because the very coverage of it does something. It gives some energy to it, even if it's questioning energy. It does give some energy to it, no doubt about it. I mean, it's the reason I bring it is because it's not without some controversy. Anybody else?
We have a few messages in the chat.
Go ahead, Angela.
So another point was made. Every time we mock fringe groups and ignore them, they grow. We need to pay attention to them with proper distance.
Yeah, let me add to that. I don't know of any societal problem, certainly none in my life that I can think of, that gets less by not talking about it. And we have a large amount of experience with this. I remember when we didn't cover AIDS early on. Oh, that's a gay thing. That's a San Francisco thing. I don't know of any societal problem that gets less. Child sex abuse. I remember a station where I worked in 1984 did the first child sex abuse story, and it was so controversial that somebody would talk about child sex abuse. They picketed our station. So I don't know of anything that gets less by not talking about it. However, I'm listening to James's good advice. Giving it any voice gives it some publicity that feeds it. So let's be careful about how we feed it. Let's be thoughtful, right?
I'll just say I learned a lot from the visual aspect of the story.
What'd you learn?
Because I work in audio, right? I'm a radio guy, but
right.
The makeup of the crowd is something that I took a lot away from.
How would this story have played on the radio?
That's a really good question. audio focused, it probably would have focused a lot more on the actual event itself, the honking of the horns, the cheering of the crowd, and all that was in here.
Yeah.
It would have been hard to bring a dynamic angle to the professor interviews. I saw they had multiple shots covering some of the professors in the story. That would have been nearly impossible to do on audio.
Very good. Thank you for that. Angela, anybody else?
There's also a question. Does this piece give us a complete picture of the beliefs of the group covered here, or are we just featuring the fringe planks on the platform?
Well, I would say I've been teaching about QAnon for over 5 years now, more than 6 years, long preceding Trump's candidacy. And it's not a complete picture. It's a very complex series of claims and so on. So no, I would say complete, no. But the fringier parts of QAnon are way crazier than this. These people are not nearly as nutty as the fringiest QAnon people are.
So Al.
Yes, Charlie?
I know people that believe that there's going to be second comings of things, such as the Virgin Mary or Jesus Christ is going to appear.
Right.
And I hate that the biblical things are leaping to mind, but I know that they have happened. Maybe they believe that Babe Ruth is looking down over this World Series. I don't know. That's an exaggeration.
I get it.
But nonetheless, I don't know how you can approach a story like this without just utter skepticism. I don't know what source they're using to get this information that, yes, this is going to happen. And I don't know how thousands
without spending too much time on QAnon, their source of information comes from the mysterious voice of Q, which nobody knows with certainty who Q is, if Q is. But skepticism, I think, Charlie, is a healthy thing. It's cynicism that I'm worried about. Skepticism means I'm open to a truth if you can show me. Cynicism means I don't believe anything, no matter what proof there is. And I think one is more difficult for us to combat than the other. Angela, is there anything else we need to pay attention to, or I'll move on?
There was one more question.
Yes.
Could the use of Southern Poverty Law Center be considered biased, or is that universally looked upon as an unbiased source for definitions of hate groups?
It's a very good question, and the answer depends on a moment in time. Southern Poverty Law Center has always had, and I've used them as a source in my reporting. I've used them actually as a teaching partner in a seminar I did several years ago around hate. So I would say that they are certainly an authoritative voice, but they are not without their own controversy, for sure. QAnoners, just as an example, but not just QAnoners, some MAGA supporters would say that Southern Poverty Law Center is not reliable and is highly skewed. So it's a good question. For sure, they've been around way before there was MAGA, way before there was Donald Trump candidacy. They've been around a long time, and they have been deeply in the fight of hate groups and racial injustice. That's without question. But because of the road they travel, they are not without their own controversies and critics. So remember, though, it wasn't a single source. There was also the FBI source on that as well. It's a fine and even enlightened question. I don't have any particular problem using them, but I might well have used other sources as well. I think I'll stop there. All right, let's move on. Bias can show up in the way that we ask questions. Let me give you an example. So as the United States was pulling out of Afghanistan, this is just a Pentagon briefing and an interview. Barbara Starr, who's a very experienced, very enlightened, thoughtful journalist, asked this question of the Pentagon press secretary.
So my two questions are, what failed in your planning? Because you didn't plan for this. You would not have planned to fly in such dangerous circumstances. And how do you determine where the responsibility lies for this failure?
Well, did you detect any bias in her questions?
Yes.
What were they?
It seems like she was telling him that they didn't plan to do something like this in these circumstances.
How did she say it? Do you remember?
I think she said like verbatim, like, you obviously didn't plan to.
Yeah, she said, yeah, exactly. She said, what failed, right?
And, you know, military types, I think they, and this might be my bias, but I think they take in mind a whole bunch of different things.
Well, that's exactly what he said. He said, I wouldn't say anything failed. You know, there were other things we could have considered, maybe other things we could have done, and we'll look at those. But I disagree with you that we failed, he said. Yeah. But she said, what failed and who is responsible for this failure? There's no chance in her question. There's no chance for you to believe that she believes there might not have been a failure. So what would have been another way to ask that question without signaling a bias that you believe there was a failure? Somebody just sort of take a shot and we might refine it. How could you have asked that question or a question like that?
I think that you could ask if they had anticipated that you might end up with a scene like this.
Okay, I'm gonna Stone, thank you for that. Let me press you a little bit. I'm going to stipulate that I don't want a question that's a yes or a no question, and I don't want a choice. Did you do this or did you do that? Take another swing with those two stipulations. Don't give me a choice, and don't ask me a yes or no question, because he's always going to say no.
Then you might want to ask something more general. What type of planning went into
Perfect. Yeah. What plans did you have? How did this play out compared to those plans? Perfect, Stone. That'd be a great way to ask the question. Yeah. Now, I suspect that Barbara Starr would say, there is no chance that this wasn't a failure. All of the evidence showed they were not prepared for this. And I'm sure that's the way she would answer that question. But all the same, you know, when you are a network at a moment in historic time, and you know that you're going to be under scrutiny for how you cover this story, it seems like a really good time to be careful with the wording of your question. So Stone, since I had your voice, and thank you, let me pose a couple of examples of the same question, and you explain to us which of these is the most biased, if any of them are. How honest do you think the CDC has been about COVID? How dishonest do you think the CDC has been about COVID? How frustrated are you, Stone, with how dishonest the CDC has been about COVID? Which of those is the most biased and why?
Well, the third one's the most biased because
why? Why is it the most biased?
It's exactly like the question about Afghanistan. It presumes a conclusion in the question itself.
Exactly. We all know CDC is dishonest. How mad are you about that, right? All right. What about number two? Is that biased as well?
It's asking that there is some sort of, it's assuming that there is a dishonesty going on. It's asking how much.
Right.
So
yeah. If I were to ask, Stone, how drunk are you right now?
Exactly.
It would plant the idea that there's a reason to ask, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What about number one?
Well, I mean, it's at least it gives it the idea that there's some type of positive aspect to the CDC. But again, you're asking for that. If there is the best question, it's number one.
All right, since you got us on base with the last one, do it again. How would you ask this question in an unbiased kind of, or in a way that does not signal biased? I'm putting you on the spot, but I know you're going to rise to it.
You probably want to ask, CDC has been about COVID. What factual conclusions has the CDC come up, or what are the studies that the CDC has relied upon to come to the conclusions that they have about COVID, and do they feel that those are.
We're trying to get to whether the CDC has been forthcoming here.
I mean, you can ask that question straight out. Has the CDC been forthcoming about their knowledge of COVID?
That's no different than asking how honest they are, though.
Yeah, I'm grappling with kind of views. I mean, I think you need to ask it in a
Okay,
positive
Stone's
way.
going to phone a friend. Somebody, he's walked us through the thinking behind these three questions. How could we ask a question about this that's not signaling a bias? I'm going to wait you out. We got 55 journalists on a call. Surely you'll come up with this.
I can take a crack at it.
Yeah, good.
I mean, I would set it up as there are many people who think that the CDC has not been forthcoming with information about COVID. What is the CDC's response to those criticisms?
Oh, actually, you could even chop off the front of that. What's your response to criticisms that the CDC hasn't been forthcoming? That would be how satisfied are you with the CDC's performance, with the CDC's providing reliable information, or how reliable do you think that the CDC has been in providing information about COVID? How much have you relied on CDC for your information and so on, right? Lots of ways you could do that would get to essentially the same thing without planting the seed. As Stone said, planting the seed of dishonesty. We may eventually get to that. If they say, well, I don't think they've been forthcoming at all. Oh, well, why not? Why wouldn't they be forthcoming? Why do you think that, right? Once they plant the seed, then we might harvest it. Good. Bias can show up in how we search for answers, of course. So it's not just the things that we do on the air. The way we use search engines like Google, for example, can set us up for biased returns. Google's just trying to help you understand what it is you ask. So if, for example, you put in coronavirus facts, Google assumes that you want factual information. And so they'll return things like the CDC and the World Health Organization and so on. But if you put in the real truth about coronavirus, or who's really behind the coronavirus, or is the government lying about the coronavirus? Back to Stone's observations about the questions. Why are they lying about the coronavirus? Loaded question. This is going to return a very different return because it assumes that you're looking for a conspiracy. And so their algorithms are going to say, oh, they're not looking for facts, they're looking for opinion. And they're going to give you a very different return. Bias can also show up in our editing and in our production. And so I want to show you something that I have not shown to anybody, but ABC, as you know, just aired this interview, and I was struck by what they promoted and then what they aired versus what actually was said in the raw version. So at the top of the screen, you're going to see what they aired. And at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see the actual video of Alec Baldwin, okay? And what I want you to do is to think about whether there was an intent to edit the story the way they edited it for you to think something that may not be accurate. So again, the top of the screen is going to be what aired, the bottom of the screen is going to be the raw. I'm going to play it back to back. Here we go.
You felt shock. You felt anger. You felt sadness. Do you feel guilt? Right there on the surface, you felt shock. You felt anger. You felt sadness. Do you feel guilt?
No. I feel that there is. I feel that someone is responsible for what happened, and I can't say who that is, but I know it's not me.
How are those two things different? What did they do in that promo?
They made it look like he had to think about the answer.
Absolutely. They slowed it down. Did you see it? Watch.
You felt shock. You felt anger. You felt sadness. Do you feel guilt?
Then watch what he actually did. So that the first version slows it down, and then they have him in slow motion licking his lips. But in reality, that's not what he did at all.
Right there on the surface, you felt shock. You felt anger. You felt sadness. Do you feel guilt?
No.
Now, I want to be careful about how I characterize this, but I don't think that was an ethical edit. I think they changed his response in the promo, in the aired version. I think they changed his response to make it look like there was a moment of repose. And in fact, he quite quickly jumped on, no, he did not lick his lips. He did not look down. He did not in slow motion answer. I think that's disingenuous. And I think that I would characterize it as an unethical edit. Anybody want to disagree with that one? The reason I pose this is because this is the kind of examination that we all undergo when people are trying to discern what they think our biases are. There is a knowable truth about how he answered this. And the public is increasingly skeptical about the way we tell them what actually occurred, because the public is increasingly literate about what's possible in our editing process. Yes, indeed, our editing can reveal our biases. This was about a week ago. This is Fox News. Look for the edit. So you'll see the edit about midway through the soundbite. You're going to see his hand disappear. That's the edit. And listen for what bias the edit signals.
Biden facing backlash for a comment during his Veterans Day address. Listen to this.
I've adopted the attitude of the great Negro at the time pitcher. His name was Satchel Paige.
What's the controversy in that edit? What did they have by virtue of editing the soundbite? What did they have President Biden saying that was so controversial? Do you need to hear it again? I'll do it again.
Biden facing backlash for a comment during his Veterans Day address. Listen to this.
I've adopted the attitude of the great Negro at the time pitcher. His name was Satchel Paige.
Why is that? Why was that edit controversial? You saw the edit, right? You saw his hand. You saw about a 5-second dissolve. For the sake of time, I'm going to answer it. They had the president of the United States describe Satchel Paige as a Negro baseball player, when in fact, this is what he said.
You know, I've adopted the attitude of the great Negro at the time pitcher in the Negro leagues, went on to become a great pitcher in the pros, into the Major League Baseball after Jackie Robinson.
What's the difference? He didn't talk about Satchel Paige as being a Negro baseball player. He said he played in the Negro Baseball League, which is a proper noun. It's actually the league in which he played, the segregated baseball league. And the Fox edit obviously made him sound like, at minimum, sort of an out of touch, uninformed person who's using vernacular that, has long outlived its accepted use. But in fact, he was using appropriate and accurate vernacular, but they edited it. And when asked why they edited it, Fox responded that they did it for the sake of time, which I find unconvincing, given that they're a 24-hour cable channel and the edit saved like 4 seconds. So I think it's an unconvincing answer. And it points to us that when you edit, particularly in the middle of a soundbite, and most particularly when it's a leader of a country, like a president or a prime minister, when you edit in the middle, you are really entering some hazardous ground. It's tough enough to edit on either end, as we all do all the time. But when you start editing in the middle, you definitely are going to change context. My recommendation is to make the edit absolutely obvious. So not a 5 or 6 or 10 frame dissolve, but instead maybe a screen wipe or maybe a flash frame. But it's got to be obvious to even a casual viewer that you've edited there in order for the viewer to say, oh, that was an edit. I just think this is disingenuous and obviously misleading. Whether they meant for it to be that or not isn't the point. The point is this issue of bias is both real and perceived. And if a reasonable person could perceive bias by an edit like that, then it's problematic. Anybody want to say anything about this?
I think part of the devil of the business, right? It's like with the stuff you showed with Fox and with the other edit you showed with the Alec Baldwin interview, I feel almost powerless to a certain degree to prevent things like that from happening, because we are reporters, and I'm sure there are people who make edits like the Alec Baldwin interview and the Fox interview who would say, hey, this is what we do. This is like the business, Fox does this because, we're Fox, and we had to do that thing with Alec Baldwin because this is television and we had to do an interesting promo. So like to what degree does, when we're working in larger corporations, does this stuff fall on us to catch it and be like, hey, that's unethical?
Well, first of all, the ones I worry about are not the ones on this call today. The ones I worry about are the 20,000 who aren't on this call today. By virtue of you being here, you're obviously concerned about perceived or real bias. And so you are in many ways the important standard bearers of quality and believability. Part of the issue for us is going to be to ask questions. To say, is that really what happened? And to be sort of the constant drumbeat for saying, what are our editing standards? How do we enforce them? Do we enforce the same editing standards across platform? Is it okay to add music on a social media piece, but we don't add it for air, for example? I would say, no. I would say we either have a standard or we don't, right? Interestingly, not 2 hours ago, I had this very conversation with Voice of America about the use of production techniques. And my answer is, look, it doesn't matter what format you're using. You either have a standard for accuracy and truth and believability and unbiased information, or you don't. And it applies across platform, So I don't really care how big your organization is or not. We each are individually responsible for each decision that we make or that we can influence. And we help contribute to the overall culture of the organization for which we work. To that, I just want to, we're closing in on the last few minutes of this conversation. So I want to give you one other example. That last week they did what they always do at the White House around this time of year. They unveiled the White House Christmas decorations. And a lot of people noticed that it was significantly softer toned than it was during the Trump administration. Elegant all the same, but not as elaborate, not over the top. like a fashion show. And so you probably saw images like this one, or like this one where Jill Biden was reading stories to children and so on, but starkly different than what we saw a year ago. You may remember what we saw a year ago. There was a highly polished video that was set to a musical score. Let me play about 20 seconds of that. Okay, so somebody said earlier that the Daily Plaza story was bothersome to them when they added music, and I wanted to add this as sort of an amen to that. So, how is this version different? I'm going to take the version that you just saw, and I'm going to change the music score behind it. Let's see how it's different. All right, how did I change that by changing the music? You're probably expecting something to jump out of the trees or something, right?
You made it objectively hilarious.
So one of the things I would say to you is this, and that is anytime we add or alter, we're changing the truth of what occurred. And I've had this conversation many times with editors, particularly NPPA award winners, who slide natural sound around. They might use a barking dog over top of a, pastoral scene or something. And, the barking dog was something they captured, some other time during the time they were there or something. But I am really concerned about this idea of adding and altering scenery, adding and altering a background. And in this case, for example, because we added music, we're adding a feeling that we felt or that we want you to feel. And that's totally subjective. It's completely biased. And when I say bias, what I mean is it's what I want you to feel. It is my bias that you should feel this. I'm telling you how to feel. And is there then a way to use music in stories? And I think one of you said earlier, if it happens in the natural environment, that's one thing. In this case, in the Biden administration, when they did the unveiling at the White House, there was actually a Marine orchestra band or something playing some Christmas songs. And I think that it would be ethically acceptable for you to record that band in the hallway of the White House and play that sound underneath photographs of the Biden White House Christmas. Because I think theoretically you could have heard that music while seeing those scenes. I think you could have done that. But I think it would be more problematic if, for example, you used even the same Marine band playing at the Christmas tree lighting a week earlier and use that music underneath this. Would it be unethical? No. But would it be a questionable editing practice? I'm going to start raising the question. What if you pulled the Marine band sound from the Trump era and played it under the Biden Christmas trees? Now you're getting crazy. And yet, I know of times when journalists have covered hurricanes, for example, and used wind noise that came from another scene an hour earlier, or used crashing waves from one place, but they're telling the story of another place. Look, the lesson is clear to me, and that is When you start adding and altering, you start adding all sorts of questions about your bias. What did you mean by doing that? I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stay around for conversation and questions if any of you want to do that. But let me just close by saying a couple of things. One, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about bias in the words that you choose, the subjective adjectives that you choose. We've talked about the need to avoid those kinds of judgmental words like just or only and such as that. We've talked about the words that you use when you're describing stories, like a car crashed through the crowd at the Christmas celebration. We've talked a lot about bias in story frame. And when you frame a story, that is the product of your bias. It's not a bad thing. It's an experiential thing that we depend on you coming up with a story frame, but know that that story frame will be under examination by your audience. And remember the CBS story, right? We started with a story about how hard the Biden administration is working to find answers. But when we just re-edit by putting the skeptic at the beginning and the end, we come up with a they're not doing enough story. Totally different story. We talked about the version of too much fairness, the fallacy of fairness. And when you are going to use reliable information because you think it's newsworthy, at minimum, surround it with truthful information. We've talked about biases that come in the way that we ask questions. Would the viewer, listener, reader believe that you have a bias just by the way you ask the question? And we've talked about bias that comes in the production of stories. And finally, I just want to say that I'm grateful that there's a group of journalists like you who are willing to set aside a very busy time of day to have this conversation. And it's a vitally important conversation for us to have. So I hope that it's useful to you. Please take time to thank your state association for making this possible if you found it valuable. I also want to take just a second, Angela, to remind folks, we have a producer project seminar coming up in March. Where we will be working with newscast producers. Angela, maybe you could pop in a link to the chat for that one, and also for the power reporting seminar for reporters, which will follow the producer seminar. It starts in late March, runs through April. The news that will break here is this, and that is that we're going to be doing some in-person teaching on this. So we're trying to go back to in-person in St. Petersburg for 3 days on each of those 2 seminars. And if you can't or don't want to come to St. Petersburg in the springtime, and who wouldn't, then know this, that we're going to stream everything virtually as well. So you can experience virtually. You'll get more out of it if you come, but if you can't or don't want to come, know that we're going to stream it. Let me say one other thing about this, and that is that we have a grant from CNN that allows us to give a 50% tuition waiver for members of NABJ, NAHJ, AAJA, NABJ, I'm missing one, NLGJA. So 50% tuition waiver if you are a member of any of those groups. The cost of joining one of those groups is far less than you would save. So there you go. Listen, guys, thanks a million for being here. I'll hang out, but I know some of you need to go save the world. We can stop the recording now.
And there was a question in the chat a bit earlier on asking, do you think we concentrate too much on finding definitive answers